Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the nature of belief formation and the nature of beliefs in general. First, before we get into it, a preliminary. This is not systematic. The reason I'm making this is because I've had a lot of conversations with people where they misunderstand the nature of belief formation and the way beliefs are typically justified, and they take either certain beliefs that they have or methods of belief formation to be either irrational or exceedingly rational, and they over-focus on these things, and it becomes a detriment to normal conversation when this happens. So this is just some thoughts I've put together on belief formation after reflection on reading a bunch of different books that are super boring. Table of contents, as all of my videos have. First, we'll talk about a mistaken idea of belief formation. We'll talk about the different settings that a belief can have, like I believe it, I don't believe it, etc. We'll talk about the nature of intelligibility. We'll talk about the smallness of the explicit. That'll make sense later. We'll talk about the illative sense, and then we'll have a short conclusion. First, a failure to understand belief formation. A lot of people have this kind of idea that the way beliefs work is that you have this kind of detached self that doesn't believe anything, and it's just kind of looking out at the world, and it doesn't believe anything until it's in some way proven. And there's kind of an assumption that this detached self is capable of justifying all of its beliefs kind of from the ground up. This idea of how belief formation works leads to what I think is a mistrust of certain authorities or traditions that they would otherwise find rational or reasonable to accept. This isn't to say, of course, that all traditions are reasonable or that all authorities are reasonable. Obviously, that makes no sense. But the idea that they don't have any justifying force is something which comes out of this. You see this in essays like Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment?, where he talks about how enlightenment is kind of this escape from the tutelage or the trust of other people's authority on certain topics. Next, there's a quick thing on meaning. There's kind of this idea that the nature of meaning is determined and atomic. So meanings, the meanings of our words, the meanings that make up our beliefs, these terms, these are, on this view, you're able to break them down into the smallest possible bits. So you have your idea of green, and your idea of green is built out of the idea of like color and something else, maybe color and extension or something like that. And all of these ideas can be broken down into like the smallest possible ideas that build up. The other idea here is that they're fully determinate. Meanings are always kind of on or they're off. There's no kind of vague meanings. But yeah, these are two ideas that I think are generally dangerous to people understanding their own belief formation and belief formation in general. Okay, next. What are the settings for a belief? What are the options? Now, for most beliefs, you can either believe them, disbelieve them, or have some kind of intermediate state. For example, you can believe that there is a small carved wooden cat on my shelf. There is. Or you could disbelieve it. Or you could say, yeah, Hound of Heaven here. He's kind of a known liar. He's like a little trustworthy, but not that trustworthy. So maybe it's like, maybe I'll like believe him like a little bit. So you got this intermediate position. All three of these are kind of normal settings for belief that people have. But I would like to add a fourth, which is undetermined. This is big for me as far as my understanding of how belief formation works and what beliefs are. Think about the idea that like you're a person or something. It's like, okay, I believe I'm a person. I see things. I hang out. I have a parent. I have two parents, maybe. Maybe I even have three. That might be weird. Funny family situation. Anyway, it's a stupid joke. Well, all of these are kind of normal beliefs that people have. But take the belief, there is a car floating 50 feet in the air. You hear this and you think about it for a second and you go, no, there isn't a car floating 50 feet in the air. How do you know this? Well, you check the meanings of the words, you check your background knowledge about the world, and you pretty quickly come to the conclusion that there are no floating cars, and so there are no floating cars floating 50 feet in the air. Yeah, but before I asked you the question, are there any cars floating 50 feet in the air, it wasn't that you believed it or had an intermediate belief or you disbelieved it. It was just none of the above. It was undetermined what your opinion about there being a car floating 50 feet in the air is. Now, I think that most beliefs that people have are a mixture of belief, disbelief, and indeterminacy, or undeterminacy. I don't know how I should say that, but yeah, that's kind of the idea. Yeah. So now we'll get to intelligibility, or the real battleground. Contexts. I've talked about this on my channel 1 or 2 times before, but we'll start with concepts. Think about a straw. This is actually, I think, the example I used last time as well. Think about a straw. When you look around at the world, you see straws. Now, to understand what a straw is, you need to understand a bunch of things. A straw, cylindrical. A straw is a cylinder, usually. It's got an empty center. It's something you use for drinking water. Yeah, so to understand a straw, not only do you need to have some kind of understanding of shapes, but you also need to have an understanding of purpose. The straw is for drinking water. A cylinder, an empty cylinder for drinking water. To understand this, you need to have an understanding of what drinking is, and you need to have an understanding of what liquids are, and what water is, and maybe other things. Most people don't just use straws for water, they use straws for soda or boba or something like that. So, and to understand drinking, not only do you need to understand the actual action of drinking, but to actually understand what drinking is, you need to understand something about nutrition. Rocks don't drink water, but people do, and so do plants. So you need to have like this understanding of nutrition to be able to understand straws. Now, all of these different ideas, liquids, nutrition, drinking, I guess cylinders, the context of shapes, social contexts, what water is, all of these things also have their own like general immediate contexts that allow you to understand them. You probably understand nutrition in relation to your feelings about how you're doing that day, in relation to what you choose to eat during the day, in relation to customs in your country. Maybe it's normal to avoid eating meat on Fridays because of some kind of Catholic history in your country. All of these things are part of your understanding of nutrition. And as a result, they play a distal role in helping you understand straws themselves. But yeah, so the important thing here is that concepts are on some level determined by, your understanding of them is determined by this like web of relationships that they have with other beliefs and other concepts that you have. Actions are very similar to concepts. If you're talking to someone and they're drinking like a large cup of water, maybe through a straw, and you say, "Why are you drinking all that water?" And they just stare at you and they go like, "Well, I'm sitting out here in the 92-degree weather." And you go, "Well, why would you do that?" And they go, "Well, I'm waiting for a package to arrive, actually." To understand why they were drinking, you had to understand the context of the heat that they were sitting in. But that suddenly didn't make sense, so the drinking doesn't make sense. The drinking making sense is kind of derivative of you understanding why they're sitting outside. The intelligibility of the action is drawn out farther and farther. There's something interesting about the difference, actually, between these relationships of actions and concepts. Concepts can go either way. You can understand straws in terms of drinking, drinking in terms of straws, nutrition in terms of water, or water in terms of nutrition. All of these relationships kind of have a two-way direction of fit, so you can understand one in terms of the other, or the other in terms of the first. Actions are a little bit different. You take a particular action, and the action kind of makes sense in terms of the global context. But the global context doesn't necessarily make sense just in terms of the action. So there's a different... It's asymmetrical in your understanding the intelligibility of actions versus understanding the intelligibility of concepts. Beliefs, as built out of concepts, suffer from the contexts that the concepts themselves are a part of. You have beliefs that are built out of the composition of concepts, so modification to the concept will modify the relationships that beliefs have and the very meanings of the beliefs themselves. The explicit and the tacit. Imagine you get hungry and you think, I want some Chick-fil-A chicken nuggets. You know, I love their chicken nuggets. I get myself a nice medium fry, 8-piece Chick-fil-A chicken nugget, a spicy chicken sandwich, no pickles, thank you very much. But you think, I want some Chick-fil-A chicken nuggets. Each of these words has their contexts, their conceptual backgrounds, their webs that allow them to make sense. These backgrounds are unarticulated. They're not there in the presence of your mind the same way the words are. You think, I want some chicken nuggets. These are all in the explicit. They're out there ready for you to see right now, to play with, to mess around with. All of these words are bounded by the other words that they are kind of surrounded by. The straw is kind of surrounded and circumscribed by the collection of concepts that make using a straw intelligible. However, these complete contexts, the complete world that surrounds the straw, that makes eating a Chick-fil-A chicken nugget, that makes wanting a Chick-fil-A chicken nugget make sense. This context is, by nature, unbounded. It's a little infinity. You have these finite little concepts that make up parts of your world, and all of these different ideas are like conditions that allow you to have the concepts. But the complete collection of conditions, the complete collection of other concepts, is just this tiny little infinity that sits inside your language. And you express this infinity, but you do it in an implicit, unarticulated way, unlike the way that you think, I want some Chick-fil-A chicken nuggets. Okay, let's look at some of the characteristics of the explicit and the tacit. The explicit allows these different little worlds or infinities to come into conflict that they would otherwise be in if they were worked out. So you think about these different backgrounds, these different implicit conceptual apparatuses. They might be in a certain level of conflict if you spent some time thinking about them, but they're not necessarily in conflict. Their conflict is undetermined, usually, insofar as it's left in the background. The more they're brought into the explicit, the more you work them out, the less undetermined they are. And the less undetermined they are, the more you can bring out genuine contradictions that sit in the background of their world. Or even if they're not straight out contradictions, maybe things that don't sit very well together. This is one of the most useful things about the explicit, is that it allows you to work out things that would otherwise be kind of incoherent but undetermined in the background of your beliefs. This also gives us an insight into the nature of insight itself. That feeling of insight before you say words or you think about the proper words to express a new thought that happens in the discovery of this is the discovery of previously unnoticed coherence or incoherence that was kind of implicit in the background. That moment when you truly come to learn something new and you bring together two different areas of intelligibility that you didn't realize could be worked into each other that way. This is that moment of insight. It's these little infinities in the background coming into coherence with each other. The explicit is also useful because it's the area of normal logical inference. The background, like I said, isn't explicitly in conflict. It can be kind of uncomfortable or partially in conflict or even in full conflict that you just ignore. But usually you're working out conflicts in the area of the explicit. And this is also the area of normal logical inference. Logical laws, like the law of excluded middle, and inference rules like modus ponens, modus tollens, all of these are things which only necessarily apply and are only actually applied in this tiny area of the explicit linguistic formulation of things that are otherwise just left undetermined in the background. So this is helpful for raising questions about the implicit assumptions in backgrounds, because you can discover that there are contradictions in virtue of using logical inferences in the area of the explicit. And now, the smallness of the explicit, or why people are more interested in worldviews and interpretations than syllogisms. An aporia is a kind of a collection of beliefs that seem to be in contradiction with each other, or actually are in contradiction with each other, and when they're put next to each other, the idea is that you sharpen your thinking by reinterpreting or discarding some of the beliefs. For an example, take Daniela, a creationist from the 1980s, and Jane, the daughter of two obnoxious scientists, one a geologist, one an astrophysicist. Jane's parents talked to her a whole lot about things that she could say to Daniela that would help her give up her stupid belief in creationism. Now, Daniela has two beliefs that she accepts. One is the inerrancy of the Bible. The other is the reliability of the scientific method in the scientific community. Now, Jane goes up to Daniela one day and she says, Daniela, there are all of these things that you accept about the general scientific community and its reliability. Like, I don't know, you believe in vaccines and you use cars and, insert other belief here. However, this community also kind of takes issue with some of the beliefs that you have because of the Bible. You think the earth was created in 6 days. You think it's like 6,000 plus years old. How do you square these two beliefs? Now, when this happens, Daniela kind of has three options. She either ditches one area of intelligibility, science, another area, religion, or she rearranges them. If she ditches science or religion, she's kind of making a very radical change to her overall worldview. However, if she reinterprets her worldview, then all she has to do is rearrange some of the concepts or modify them in certain ways. Some examples of reinterpretation could be that she decides she doesn't take a literal reading of Genesis or a literalistic reading, such that Genesis doesn't actually describe the world being created in 6 days and God resting on the seventh, but rather there's some deeper meaning here that isn't supposed to be a literal description of the history of the world. Alternatively, she could reinterpret her understanding of science. Maybe she becomes an instrumentalist about the nature of scientific inquiry, such that she no longer believes that science tells you true things about the world, but rather that science tells you truths about how the world will act in the future given certain conditions, certain actions that she could take. Now, let's look at some characteristics of this aporia and worldviews in general. Any of the different beliefs that Daniela modifies here could be modified at any level. She could give up her belief in science. She could give up her belief in religion. She could reinterpret them in any number of ways. There's nothing in her world which forces her to choose one way rather than another. Other beliefs can play a part in this decision-making process. For example, she could have an aunt and an uncle who are, doing research on the function of vaccines and how effective they are. and her aunt and uncle have all of these, Big Bang related beliefs. Very scary. And that might play into, and her trust in them might play into which way she reinterprets her worldview. But none of these individual beliefs can play a final ground for her reinterpreting her entire world, because each of them could also just be thrown away. If she ditches her belief in science, she'll lose, de facto, some of her trust in her aunt and uncle and their ability to form reliable beliefs. So you can always widen the net. Anything that a person can bring into a conversation to force you to change your view is something that can also, in principle, be thrown away. And belief formation is kind of about finding reasonable ways to help someone adjust their worldview rather than forcing them into one view or the other. Most people, another implication here is that most people who have unshakable views on some subject are operating with a kind of dishonesty about the relationship between their explicit ideas and the intelligible ground from which they spring. Most of our ideas are partially undetermined. Most of our ideas have only a kind of probable or partial justification on the basis of the rest of our worldviews. And people who have unshakable views, or at least say they have unshakable views, usually have a kind of skin in the game which forces them to say that they have this kind of unshakable or absolutely certain view on one subject or another. Often this is the result of saying something in public and then refusing to back down because they're worried they'll look stupid, or maybe they belong to a religious community, so if they changed a specific view, this would make them a social outcast, or maybe they belong to, I'll just leave it there. So I think there's a kind of dishonesty almost always. I don't know if this is true in every case, but in most cases, people with unshakable views on specific subjects usually are working with a kind of dishonesty about the relationship between their views and the actual justifications for them. I have a little thing on interpretive interconnection. Because of these relationships between beliefs, there's an interpretive connection between different beliefs that people have in different concepts. I have a quote here from C.S. Lewis. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Your belief in the exact reliability of Scripture, the genres of the different books of the Bible, the reliability of the scientific method, all of these things interpret each other. There is a connection between all your beliefs where they have these interpretive relationships. Next, we have the illative sense. Are any of my beliefs rational? Elation. Elation is a term that I think comes from the scholastic period in the history of philosophy, and it's the sense that drives inference. We've actually hinted at it earlier, that feeling of insight that allows you to draw new conclusions or learn new things that happens prior to you formulating things verbally. Elation is the sense which drives inference. You take an argument, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal. There's an inference from the first two premises that Socrates is mortal. Elation is the sense that drives the inference, that draws this connection between the first premise and the second premise, and allows you to see the conclusion in a new way. This understanding of elation that I'm describing right here is restricted to syllogisms, and it is obviously, as a result, rule-governed. This is something which happens in the explicit. And what it does is it brings into alignment different intelligibilities, different little infinities that are implied in people's language. John Henry Newman, in his fantastic little book, Towards a Grammar of Assent, expands the idea of elation to encompass kind of a complete worldview that a person has, rather than simply restricting this idea of an inferential sense to the explicit. And as a result, he has this idea of illative rationality. He calls it the rationative faculty, and the illative sense is that's what he calls it. The illative sense is the virtue, it's the perfection of your rationative faculty, the rational faculty. The illative sense in Newman's understanding is something which is not necessarily rule governed, and as a result, it's not predictable or absolutely certain. People's belief formations are not absolutely certain or rule governed. As I talked about earlier, there's quite a few different ways that that Daniela could modify her beliefs, and there's nothing which is absolutely forcing her to choose between these different modifications. This is kind of a sense that she has that works in the background of her life that allows her to get better at choosing between different ways of reinterpreting her worldview. And hypothetically, if she does this properly, this is something that she will learn how to do and get better at. This is something that is susceptible to training. If you read a bunch of books on a specific subject, or just on subjects in general, if you read a bunch of different books and you kind of think about them and work through the ideas and grapple with the issues, then you'll get better at your own belief formation. Examples of other people doing this are also useful. For example, you can hear stories of other people's belief formation. This could happen either as a result of reading about history or reading fiction or watching movies, though often fiction only has kind of mediocre examples of belief formation. I think the best example of someone working through belief formation and coming to a rational reinterpretation of her world that I've ever read is probably the book Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. I know I mentioned him before, but he's got some nice things to say. That book is fantastic. And there's an interesting thing about illative rationality is that it's partially free and partially constrained. We've probably all been in circumstances where we wanted a certain thing to be true, and we had like a certain amount of freedom, but not as much as we thought we did in continuing to believe that thing. And so our belief is, in a certain way, dishonest, but we still work it out explicitly as if it was something that we were like totally committed to. In this way, our beliefs are partially constrained by the background. They're also partially free. I think people have a certain level of choice. I'm like a moderate doxastic voluntarist, for those wondering. People are partially free in their belief formation. There's a kind of trivial sense in which this is true, where you have a couple different options and you spend a whole lot of time studying the arguments in favor of one position. There's a more subtle way that people have this kind of freedom in belief formation, and this is trust in research communities. Who will I trust? No one has time to learn anything, so a big question in your belief formation is going to be which groups of people, which research communities am I willing to trust to a certain level? Maybe I trust the history of the Catholic Church and the belief formation found there. Maybe I put a whole lot of trust just in the research community surrounding sociology. Maybe I believe the Mormon elders or something like that. This is something that, again, is not entirely free, but I think this is one of the clearest areas of freedom where people have a level of control over which communities they will put their trust in the future. However, it's not entirely free. I cannot but believe that I will fall when I jump off my bed. Here's a quote from John Henry Newman. The authoritative oracle, that is the illative sense, which is to decide our path, is something more searching and manifold than such jejune generalizations as treatises can give, which are most distinct and clear when we least need them. This kind of belief formation that I'm describing is much more global. It's much larger than what happens in our explicit thought. It's much larger than what happens when you read a specific argument. People spend a long time coming up with different worldviews and modifying their own worldview and making decisions about which kind of research programs to trust. And this is something which is just simply more complicated than what rule-governed thought allows for. I just wanted to reiterate that the illative sense here is an intellectual virtue. It's the perfection of this kind of rational faculty we have, which judges between worldviews. The illative sense works through explicit content, taking into account the massive background against which it works. And then there's this idea of bringing us into a closer relationship between the background that we have in honest ways. I've talked about how people have kind of dishonest beliefs, kind of imperfect belief formation practices where they try to be more free than they actually are with relation to the background which makes their beliefs possible. Now I have another quote. This is one of my favorites from Children of Dune, the third Dune novel by Frank Herbert. Anyone can be a truth-sayer, even you, the preacher said. It's a matter of self-honesty about the nature of your own feelings. It requires that you have an inner agreement with truth, which allows ready recognition. There's this idea that you're not free, you're not entirely determined, but there's this level of honesty, this kind of emotional relationship that you have to have with the background, with your life, with everything, that allows you into this kind of rational belief formation process. Conclusion. Or, I hope this helped. I hope this helps. A lot of people are kind of uncomfortable with certain beliefs that they have that are derived from perceived authorities. I hope this has kind of helped some people understand that that isn't necessarily an irrational thing to do, to have some level of trust in authorities. That isn't to say that all trust in authorities or traditions is rational, but obviously they play some kind of justifying role because they work into this complete conceptual web that we have that allows us to that helps us to understand the world. Maybe this helps with some people who are confused about why they have a hard time convincing some people with arguments. Why won't people believe my syllogism? You see the argument right here? It's right here. Why are they trusting this other group of people? I have a very clear argument. They didn't even deny a premise. What's going on with that? I don't understand. Well, belief formation is way more complicated than just simply inferences in the explicit. And I hope this helped people who have this problem understand that worldviews, even their own worldview, is significantly less rule-governed than they'd like to believe. It'd be nice if you could just lay out a set of arguments and have everyone agree with you, but again, rationality I don't think is rule-governed. That doesn't mean it's irrational. I don't think all things that are non-rule governed are irrational, but that does mean that you can't force people to have certain beliefs. And then maybe this has helped some people understand their own concerns about the honesty or dishonesty of their own inferences and their own worldview and beliefs. Most of these people that I just described have been me, people with different kinds of insecurities about their beliefs, people with problems in helping other people see things that they think should be obvious, people worried about specific sources of their beliefs. And yeah, I hope this has helped for people who have those problems, and I hope you have an excellent day. Goodbye.